You just hand it straight over to him. Well, good evening, everybody. It is time for us to get started. We're at the end of 2 Samuel 19. 2 Samuel 19, we're going to start in verse 41. So, David is traveling back to Jerusalem, and we've looked at all of these stories of the various people that he's met with. People have been rushing out to the Jordan to meet him so that they can be seen coming back across with the king, so that they can get a first word in with the king as he's coming back. As we'll continue to see, David's return and the reconsolidation of his power as king is not some simple thing. This is going to be fraught with all kinds of difficulties. And one of the things that we have been seeing is that part of it, we know that this whole mess has its origins in David himself anyway. And David is doing things to exacerbate that problem. He has, for example, heard talk among the elders of Israel. They want to bring the king back. And so David contacts the elders of Judah and kind of lights a fire under them and says, well, hey, are you going to let Israel beat you guys to the punch? You ought to go ahead and be the ones to make the suggestion to bring me back. Right? It's a political move that is based on this division that already exists between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, between Israel and Judah. And so what we're about to read should come as no surprise to us. Whenever David uses his politics to... when he plays off of these divisions for political advantage, well, we shouldn't be surprised to see what happens as a result of that. Let's go ahead and go to God together in prayer, and then we'll start our reading. Righteous Heavenly Father, thank you for blessing us with all the good things you've given us today. We thank you, Father, for our time together to study from your word. We pray, Father, that you help us to discern your will, help us to be faithful in your kingdom. We thank you, Father, most of all for the gifts that you've given us in your Son, Jesus. It's in his name that we offer our prayer. Amen. Okay, 2 Samuel 19:41. Then all the men of Israel came to the king and said to the king, why have our brothers, the men of Judah, stolen you away and brought the king and his household over the Jordan and all David's men with him? And all the men of Judah answered the men of Israel, because the king is our close relative. Why then are you angry over this matter? Have we eaten at all at the king's expense, or has he given us any gift? And the men of Israel answered the men of Judah, we have 10 shares in the king, and in David also we have more than you. Why then did you despise us? Were we not the first to speak of bringing back our king? But the words of the men of Judah were fiercer than the words of the men of Israel. Now there happened to be a worthless man whose name was Sheba the son of Bichri, a Benjaminite. And he blew the trumpet and said, we have no portion in David, and we have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. Every man to his tents, O Israel. So all the men of Israel withdrew from David and followed Sheba the son of Bichri. But the men of Judah followed their king steadfastly from the Jordan to Jerusalem. All right, so this division between Israel and Judah it grows and finally comes to a head. Right? We've not reached the period of the divided kingdom yet, but we're getting all sorts of foretastes of that at this point. But it starts off with this argument about who has a greater claim over the king, which on the face of it should strike us as a pretty silly argument. If they're one nation, well, they all have a claim over the king. It's not like one side should be trying to steal the king over for themselves to the exclusion of the others. I see Wayne's hand. But Israel is upset at Judah because it seems that Judah has made this move to bring David over without including the rest of Israel in things. Go ahead, Wayne.
Well, this is just like what we have in our system today. We have Republicans and Democrats, and they're not even alike. They're not on the same page, and they don't agree with anybody else. We're divided. I mean, it's almost the same thing. We're divided because it's totally conservative against liberal, Democrat liberal, and Republican conservative, and they don't agree with anything. And it's just almost like a divided nation that we have here.
Yeah.
And then same thing here. They had a divided nation. It went all the way back before David, and a long ways all the way back. It wasn't anything simple. It just kind of grew out of everything.
Yeah, and there's from this story we can see the consequences of this kind of well, I guess the word that we would use for it is tribalism, incidentally. Right? And that definitely fits here since we are talking about the different tribes of Israel. But polarization is something that we ought to be really wary of, and something we ought to pray against ourselves. And because we'll see where it leads. Whenever you have, because this is all, it's team-based animosity. Right? Why is Israel mad? Well, because Judah brought the king over instead of Israel. Right? And they're going to be arguing about who's got a greater share in the team. Our side has a greater share. Well, our side has a better share. He's our relative. This is why we've done this. And at the end of it, and I think I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but you look at the end of this altercation, there's no principled conclusion to this disagreement. The end of chapter 19 is, "But the words of the men of Judah were fiercer than the words of the men of Israel." All right, so who ends up ending the argument? Well, the side that yells the loudest, basically. Yeah, go for it, Keith.
This is an argument between brethren.
Yeah.
And that's the fascinating thing about it. The Jews are descendants of Judah. Mm-hmm. And the Israelites are the descendants of Abraham. But they're all Israelites.
Yeah, they're all sons of Israel, the man Israel.
Yeah, and they're fighting here over who has a larger portion.
Yeah.
And so like Wayne said, we have that among brethren.
We certainly do. We certainly do. And that's something we need to file away for a minute. We might not get to it tonight. Lord willing, on Sunday, by the latest. This matter of how brother treats brother under the monarchy in Israel. This is a big deal in the book of Samuel. It's going to come up. In fact, we'll see it at the beginning of chapter 20. A rather perverse use of the word brother. Just pay attention for it and you'll see it. But yeah, this way of dealing with things where it's just my side versus your side, and if you come in by the doors, we're going to come in by the windows, and we're never going to agree on anything because, my whole operating principle is, own the Israelites, or own the libs, or own the conservatives, or own the Jews, or whatever. Right? That's your guiding principle. You have no principles. And we have reached a point where these people have no principles. If the story has started to look like a complete mess, and you've been wondering where is all of this going? What is the point of all of this? A lot of it falls on the fact that we're looking at a people who have no principles. And that leads the story in all kinds of chaotic directions. Okay, go ahead, Wayne.
It's just neither here nor there, but it's like Keith kind of alluded to. It sounded like two kids.
Yeah.
They sound like two little kids going, hey, yeah.
Oh, yeah. This is very much an I'm not touching you kind of argument.
All it is. Just two little kids going at it.
Yeah.
So crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at the men of Israel and their complaint, if we accuse them of being childish, they look like they're being really fickle here. And this we can put this on Israel. The people are being fickle because they were just in revolt. All of them. These are people who had yesterday been following after Absalom. And now today, they are making arguments about who's got a greater share in King David. And as we just read, at least for the men of Israel, they end this passage in revolt again. All right, they're turning on a dime here as to whether they're going to be loyal to David or not. Again, you can see they have absolutely no principles. So they're being fickle. They have no principle. But this complaint comes down to David's apparent favoritism. We'll talk about this in just a second. Go ahead, Jason.
Well, what right does anyone who claims to either be, at that time, a professing Jew or an Israelite, or to us today as Christians, gives us the right to withhold or to lord over or to expect a larger portion than our brethren?
Yep.
Right? None of it belongs to us in the first place, and to hoard up for that for ourselves, that it is in no way in alignment with God from the beginning of the book through the end of the book.
Exactly.
And anyone who withholds from their brother, right, and then for them, they sacrifice their portion for what they want here, for what they might lay a hold of in the after.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is all to connect that with this, just the absurdity of all of it. How can a king be more my king than your king? Right? Like, what does that even mean? Like, David's only 90% your king. He's 100% my king. Like, that's nonsense. Or to put it in Christian terms, like, what share of eternity are we expecting? Right? Like, I've got 5 shares in eternity. You only have 1. Like, it's absurd when we're dealing with the infinite blessings of God for people to try to lord it over each other and say, well, I'm getting better than you. I am better than you. It's just nonsense. It's pure nonsense. All right. So, this complaint that Israel has comes down to David's apparent favoritism, which is impossible to deny, like we talked about earlier. Just the way that he treats his own house as better than other people's houses, David also treats his own tribe better than the other tribes. He has shown favoritism. All right, when he heard Israel discussing bringing him back over, he urged the elders of Judah to beat Israel to the punch, and that's what this is all about. It is tension that David himself, maybe he hasn't caused it entirely by himself, but he has really exacerbated it here, which seems ill-advised for a king who is trying to reclaim and reunite his kingdom. You look in the position that David is in. He's been exiled over the river for a little while, and he's trying to come back into his kingdom and reclaim his throne, and he's playing up political divisions within his kingdom. It seems foolhardy for David to be acting this way. And so, in all of this, we don't have any kind of principled winner. There's no good guy to point to in this story. Not David, not Judah, not Israel, certainly not Sheba, the son of Bichri. We've reached a point in the story where everyone is frustratingly without principle. So just when it seems that David... Go ahead, Jason.
David, and as well as we, need to be conscious that David is known as the one who is anointed by God.
Yeah.
And for him to come into a situation where he has an opportunity to bring peace and unity, and as a representative of God, conducts himself in such a way,
It's
he
shameful.
is probably not even thinking about the way that reflects so poorly upon God.
Yeah.
For, if people today say, well, if you're a person of God and you act like that, then I don't want to have any business with the church. And we run into that probably a lot more often than people want to admit, not realizing that when we carry the banner of Christ, or as David carried the banner of God, we are a representative, or a written epistle, or however analogy you want to use. And if we misrepresent God, you have to represent him probably 50 times for every one bad time you do in order to break even in the eyes of the world. And so to not be cognizant of that and to allow ourselves to backslide even once, and we know it's going to happen, but even once, the amount of damage that does before you can, earn someone's trust or faith back or whatever it's unconscionable or unimaginable in some cases. And I've been the victim of it myself. And what withheld me probably the most is that I would go to church when I was a young man before I joined the church, and I would go in and I would see people who would talk one way and act a different way.
Yeah.
And I said, well, what difference is this than the people who I knew down the street, just on the corner, doing whatever that people do on the corner. We don't need to talk about that. But, what's the difference between one hypocrite to the next? That's the only thing I'm exchanging. And so David probably isn't even aware of what he's probably not even thinking about that. And if he is, and he's just brushing it to the side, then shame on him.
Yeah, the big difference is the people down on the corner will treat you nice. But go ahead, Wayne.
But you know what's missing here?
What's up?
The big deal. They're not turned to the Lord.
Yeah. And actually, it's been a while since we've done a check of that, when the last time was that the Lord was mentioned by any of these folks.
Yeah.
I need to go back and dig into that.
That's what's missing here, is that we don't turn back to the Lord. Talk about us.
Yeah.
We continue our individual beliefs and what I think and what I like. We don't go back to the Lord to find out what He says. And that would just be that would be the uniting factor, that everybody agreed together on what the Lord says.
Right. That ought to be the source of our unity, is our devotion to the Lord. To go back to what Jason was saying, there's a passage in the prophets that we ought to have at the front of our minds all the time. It's quoted in the New Testament. It ought to scare us. My name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. That's what the Lord says through the prophets. That, again, that ought to terrify us. That we would be the reason why someone out in the world denies Jesus Christ. Not that they've come to know Him and decided to deny Him on the merits, but because they looked at you or me and the way that we were living and the way that we were treating people and have decided, that ain't it. God's not there, if there is a God. So, all right, I'll climb down off that soapbox. We'll come back to the text. So now David is dealing with another revolt, just right on the heels of the previous revolt. This time the culprit is a worthless man, literally a man of Belial, named Sheba. That's the same description that was used of Eli's sons and of Samuel's sons earlier in the book. Sheba, who is, appropriately, he is a Benjaminite. Now, there's no indication that he's related to Saul, but the tribal connection is appropriate, that the division still goes back to which tribe is going to be head over all of the others. But most importantly, you look at Sheba's call. We have no portion in David, and we have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. Every man to his tents, O Israel. All right, I want us to hold on to that and turn to 1 Kings chapter 12. Because whenever the kingdom finally does formally divide, it's going to happen in exactly these terms. All right, so Sheba the son of Bichri has said, we have no portion in David, as he's blown the trumpet. He says, we have no portion in David, we have no inheritance in the son of Jesse, every man to his tents, O Israel. So 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 16. And when all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, what portion do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Look now to your own house, David. So Israel went to their tents. But Rehoboam reigned over the people of Israel who lived in the cities of Judah. Then King Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was taskmaster over the forced labor, and all Israel stoned him to death with stones. And King Rehoboam hurried to mount his chariot to flee to Jerusalem. So Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. And when all Israel heard that Jeroboam had returned, they sent and called him to the assembly and made him king over all Israel. There was none that followed the house of David, but the tribe of Judah only. All right, what happens here with Sheba is explicitly a foreshadowing of what is to come. All the men of Israel withdrew from David and followed Sheba the son of Bichri, but the men of Judah followed their king steadfastly from the Jordan to Jerusalem. So the kingdom hasn't fallen apart yet, but we've already been told more or less that it will fall apart, and in what terms it will fall apart. All right, any questions or comments about that before we continue on? Okay. So, the next stories are mostly going to focus on Sheba, with a little pit stop in Jerusalem first. Let's start with verse 3. And David came to his house at Jerusalem, and the king took the 10 concubines whom he had left to care for the house, and put them in a house under guard, and provided for them, but did not go into them. So they were shut up until the day of their death, living as if in widowhood. All right, so David has spent quite a long time away from Jerusalem. But the only thing that we see him do in Jerusalem, now that he's finally returned to Jerusalem, is practically a footnote, that David's return into Jerusalem. The only thing that we see him do concerns the 10 concubines that he had left behind to guard the house whenever he fled Jerusalem. And we remember the story how whenever Absalom comes into Jerusalem and takes over, Ahithophel counsels him that he should go into his father's concubines and make himself a stench to his father and strengthen his position in that way. And so Absalom does that. He publicly violates David's concubines up on the roof of the palace in a tent that they have set up there for the purpose, as a means of shaming his father, strengthening his claim over Israel. The whole story is sordid from beginning to end. Not just what Absalom does, but the fact that David had left them there for that purpose to begin with, leaving these 10 women behind to watch over the house. The word's literally to guard the house. The ESV makes it sound a little more tame than that, to care for the house, like their job was to keep the place clean while David was gone. There's actually some wordplay going on here in chapter 20, verse 3, that they had been left to guard the house, but David took them and put them in a guardhouse, and left them there till they died. Excuse me. So he's left these 10 women behind as guards. Absalom violates them. So David comes back and closes them up under guard. Now, we should ask why the prophets have chosen to include this story and this story alone from David's return to Jerusalem. Because immediately after this verse, we're going to be back out in the field chasing Sheba down. The only thing that we see happen in Jerusalem at this point is this particular story. So beyond just the narrative function of providing some closure to the story about Absalom taking his father's concubines, this story is traditionally understood to be a form of parable. It's something that actually happened, but the details of it point to something outside of itself. Points to the state of Israel's relationship with the house of David. Because Israel, they've just argued that they have 10 shares in David to Judah's 1. And then they followed Sheba. Later on in the history, the northern tribe's departure will be represented by 10 pieces of cloth that are taken in the hand. And I don't think it's a coincidence that here you have 10 concubines right in the midst of this story about the northern tribes trying to leave the house of David. 10 concubines for 10 tribes. David gets them back, like he gets the tribes back, but they are no longer fully his in the way they once were, and neither is Israel. And the way that he treats them, we'll see that the relationship between David and Israel is ultimately going to be pretty similar to David's relationship between himself and these concubines. In other words, it's mostly going to be non-existent. So he's, from a technical sense, David has done... he's not exactly done wrong by these women. He's not cast them out because Absalom has defiled them. They're still being taken care of. But at the same time, they're put into a really awful situation. Shut up under guard until the day of their death, living as if in widowhood, even though they are not widows. Their man is still alive. And yet they're living as if they're forced to live as if he's not. Okay. We'll bring them up again momentarily as we look at what happens with Sheba. But any questions or comments about that before we continue on? Go ahead, Jason.
Seems like David is trying to shut up his shame, to put it away so that the other people who were around at the time of Absalom would have known the shame that was with David, and he would have to be seen with that shame open and publicly if he didn't put these women away. And so another politicking move for him, but it's also of appearances. And so shame on him again, because he is now punishing these women for something, first of all, they couldn't control. I'm sure they had very little choice in the matter as it was. But for him to do something to them because they were punished for the thing that he did wrong in the first place, right? Seems, once again, like a David kind of thing, where he's done this multiple times at this point now.
Everybody else has to suffer for him.
And it's not like anybody forgets what they saw on the rooftop. You know what I mean? It doesn't matter if these women are there or not, but,
try to get it out of sight and out of mind, Louise. Where would they go anyway? And that's a good question. That's why I say that as uncomfortable as this story is, there is a sense in which David isn't exactly wronging them. There's a sense in which he is, in the fact that he has shut them up. In other words, they're cut off from any kind of regular society and any kind of association with him, even. He is still providing for them. It's the same question that we had to ask of Bathsheba. Right? When we asked, why is God letting David get away with marrying Bathsheba? And we pointed out that in the ancient context, it's not so much that David is getting away with marrying this woman. It's that having violated her, now he has to provide for her the rest of her life, the rest of his life, which is something that the law requires of someone who does that. And so he is still at least providing for them. We'll say he could have done worse, but I think we could also argue that he could have done better. It's a terrible story, either way we cut it. So that's a good question. Thank you, Louise. All right, any other questions or comments before we continue in the story? Go ahead, Jason.
Well, just one little one, I guess. I feel like he is punishing them.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm not a wife, right? But I'll try to do my best to understand the situation, even from a husband's perspective. It is our duty to provide and to want to be close and to be with the one whom we are betrothed. And so to deny them that is to take away something that is so pivotal to their role and what they want to do. So, I mean, if I couldn't be with my wife for the rest of my life, I don't know, I'm sure most men would say this, at least I hope they would.
Yeah.
That would be a punishment all in its own. And so, I mean, it is a form of punishment. And I mean, you were once in the palace and you were once, you're the wife of the king and you live in a guard shack, in the dark or whatever. Yeah. And you can no longer be with your husband.
Yeah.
Because of what they did.
Yeah. You are in a harem that the king will no longer ever visit. Go ahead, Wayne.
Well, as concubines, let me understand this correctly. As concubines, they're basically sex slaves.
More or less.
More or less.
We shouldn't understand this as some kind of romantic relationship between David and these
They
men.
don't belong on the same line as husband and wife.
They don't what?
They don't belong on the same line, on the same level as husband and wife.
Legally? No, but yeah, go ahead.
But, I mean, they're not, it's not that David is obligated to take care of them the way he has to take care of his wife. That's why I say
legally they don't have wife status. No.
Elsewise, they would be the same thing. He already has 5 bajillion wives, anyways.
Yeah.
So why is the text differentiating one from the other? And that's my question. Why are they different? And the reason is because they're not on the same level.
Yeah.
So he's not obligated to take care of them. And so in this, like Jason pointed out, to kind of cover his shame, to cover, kind of put them, out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah.
That's what it goes, out of sight, out of mind. So he puts them in a guardhouse so it keeps them out of the way. So, and it just kind of plasters over or whitewashes the whole episode.
Yeah. We are... I guess part of the challenge of talking about these situations in a modern context is that we're talking about something that we recognize to be fundamentally immoral anyway. The fact that David is in possession of at least 10 concubines, as well as the many wives that he has acquired for himself. Does the law require him to take care of the concubines? That I would need to give some thought to, because I, off the top of my head, cannot recall any ordinances in the law of Moses concerning concubines at all. At the very least, we should, so there is some cultural understanding behind this. At the very least, we should understand that David is not particularly rising above his cultural standards in the way that he is treating these women. Ginger, we got the mic coming up. While the mic is coming up, I do want to say the text itself notes for us the horror of this situation, like the weirdness of this situation, living as if in widowhood. They're widows, but they're not widows. Right? Their man is still alive. Their man is still providing for them. But otherwise, they are stuck living as widows, even though they're not widows. Like the text wants us to see their situation as wrong on that level, at least. All right, go ahead, Ginger.
Just coming from it from a different perspective, is it not possible maybe that they didn't want to have him come back? Maybe that they could have, they could have still resented him for leaving him behind. They were obviously traumatized by this whole situation.
Yeah.
So this may have been, at least in his head, a kindness to them as well. Just a different option. But I can definitely see how the parable would lend itself to viewing this in not so kind of a light.
Yeah, and one thing that we should notice about the whole way that this story shakes out is that there's not really any attention given to their wants, their desires, their personhood. We are talking about a time when these women would have been viewed, treated as property for David's gratification. And the scriptures do give us, the scriptures humanize them more than your typical ancient person would have, thankfully. Okay, so let's continue into verse 4. I think I've got it in my notes to bring them back up again in the context of what's to come. Let's start in verse 4. Then the king said to Amasa, "Call the men of Judah together to me within 3 days, and be here yourself." So Amasa went to summon Judah, but he delayed beyond the set time that had been appointed him. And David said to Abishai, "Now Sheba the son of Bichri will do to us more harm than Absalom. Take your Lord's servants and pursue him, lest he get himself to fortified cities and escape from us." And there went out after him Joab's men, and the Kerethites and the Pelethites, and all the mighty men. They went out from Jerusalem to pursue Sheba the son of Bichri. When they were at the great stone that is in Gibeon, Amasa came to meet them. Now Joab was wearing a soldier's garment, and over it was a belt with a sword in its sheath fastened on his thigh. And as he went forward, it fell out. And Joab said to Amasa, "Is it well with you, my brother?" And Joab took Amasa by the beard with his right hand to kiss him. But Amasa did not observe the sword that it was in Joab's other hand. So Joab struck him with it in the stomach and spilled his entrails to the ground without striking a second blow, and he died. Then Joab and Abishai his brother pursued Sheba the son of Bichri, and one of Joab's young men took his stand by Amasa and said, Whoever favors Joab and whoever is for David, let him follow Joab. And Amasa lay wallowing in his blood in the highway, and anyone who came by seeing him stopped. And when the man saw that all the people stopped, he carried Amasa out of the highway into the field and threw a garment over him. When he was taken out of the highway, all the people went on after Joab to pursue Sheba the son of Bichri. All right, so apart from the matter with the concubines, David immediately turns to chasing Sheba. He sees Sheba as an even more pressing threat than Absalom. So he asks Amasa, formerly Absalom's general, whom David has appointed to be his own general, he asks Amasa to muster the army of Judah within 3 days. Now, this is a pretty quick turnaround for an ancient muster. Something should have been doable. We don't know why. The reason's not stated, but Amasa fails to meet David's timetable for the muster. And so David turns to Abishai, the third brother from the sons of Zeruiah, or the other two being Joab and Asahel. So David has Abishai go out at the head of a group of men that have seen a lot of action over the past several chapters. They're referred to as Joab's men, the Kerethites and Pelethites, and the mighty men. And we should notice, though, that even though there is a group referred to as Joab's men, Joab is still not at the head of the army. Instead, it's Abishai, his brother. David is apparently resolved to keeping Joab out of command. But the fact that these guys are referred to as Joab's men tells you that that's going to be a difficult task, keeping Joab out of command. Joab has made quite a name for himself and has a following among David's men. And putting Abishai at the head of the army also doesn't keep Joab out of battle. Joab is present for their going out to chase Sheba. And they go up to Gibeon, and there at Gibeon, Amasa meets up with Abishai's contingent. And again, there, who should we see but Joab? And in a move that it reminds us, honestly, it ties a lot of stories together. We're reminded of the story of Ehud, the judge. We're reminded of Judas. We're reminded of Abner earlier at Gibeon. And we're reminded of Joab himself earlier when he murdered Abner in Hebron. You got all these things coming together in this story. Joab it goes out to meet Amasa and hoodwinks him, deceives him. He reaches out with his right hand to take Amasa by the face and kiss him, greeting him as a brother. But in his other hand, the hand that an ancient person would not expect to see a sword in, the hand that Ehud, the judge, wielded his sword in, Joab has a sword and he disembowels Amasa right there in the field. Now, I mention all of those names because we're going to return to most of them. It's probably going to be Sunday morning, Lord willing. But the story is reminding us, or alluding to, a lot of things in this story. We'll stick to what's going on here for now. Obviously, Joab is moving to reclaim his command. He's just murdered his rival, Amasa. Look at the way that Joab's young man frames things. He takes his stand next to Amasa as Amasa is laying there wallowing in his own blood and guts. Joab's young man takes his stand there, so whoever favors Joab and whoever is for David, let him follow Joab. Notice he's framing loyalty to Joab as loyalty to David. Joab is boxing David in here. He's going to have all these men following him under the understanding that doing so also means being loyal to David. All right, you want to serve King David? Get in line behind Joab. He's going to lead you to victory. So if David rejects Joab again, he risks alienating all of these men. It's a really shrewd tactic on Joab's part, which is what we've come to expect from him. Poor Amasa, is allowed to suffer until he dies. This is one of the rare occasions in the book of Samuel where someone doesn't take the initiative to put someone else to death. This is one of the few dying men in the whole book of Samuel who is allowed to bleed out before he finally dies. All the worse for him. Excuse me. Everyone stopping to stare at him reminds us of the earlier story of Asahel's death at the hands of Abner, which we'll come back to on Sunday. We'll see if Amasa has anyone to avenge him on Joab the way that Joab avenged Asahel on Abner. So to add insult to injury, Joab's young man, apparently noticing that everybody is stopping to stare at Amasa, Joab's young man has Amasa moved out into a field and covered up so that the spectacle of his death doesn't slow up the advance of the army. And that's explicitly what this is about. Everybody's standing around looking, so Amasa has the dying man moved so that when he was taken out of the highway, all the people went on after Joab to pursue Sheba, the son of Bichri. So Amasa, besides figuratively being in Joab's way, by having his old command, in his death, he is physically in Joab's way And so they just move him out of Joab's way. The inhumanity of it is supposed to shock us, especially considering, again, that Joab's own brother was once similarly treated. So we'll come back to that on Sunday. That's all I had to say about that passage. We're going to pick up on, they'll finally catch up with Sheba in the next passage. And we're going to have quite a bit to say about that. Any final questions or comments before we dismiss for the evening? All right. Well, thank you so much for your kind attention and your questions and comments this evening.
Yeah, I've got it. Yeah. Dennis is already texted, so